Neff presents an unabridged recording of The Red Winter, Book 5 of the Tapestry, written and performed by Henry H. Neff. Text copyright 2014 by Random House Children's Books. All rights reserved. Chapter 8. Flotsam and Jetsam. The small talk surrounding Prusias became even smaller. As the minutes ticked past, polite inquiries about a neighbor's lands and subjects dwindled to awkward observations about the weather, the condition of the roads, and the pitiable drabness of the workshop humans. The King of Bliss glared at the fool next to him, a lord from Vrusk whose lands contained mountains of iron ore. It was the only reason the fop was suffered to live, much less attend the viewing. Glancing about the impromptu command center, Prusias wondered if this gathering had been wise. Mr. Bond had been against it from the start. The imp, as usual, had taken great pains to enumerate all that could go wrong, offending the uninvited, the unthinkable prospect of defeat, and, of course, technical difficulties. Technical difficulties. The king glowered at the workshop engineers, futzing with their equipment, skittering with expressions of mounting anxiety. "What do you make of this cold spell, your majesty?" inquired the ironmonger. "A contrivance of your enemies?" Conversations hushed as Prusias turned to face his questioner. The smile died on the baron's face, a mushroom dripping butter from the end of his tiny fork. The king smiled pleasantly. "You will never return to Vrusk, my friend." Aloud, he said, "Which enemies would you be referring to?" Rowan, stammered the demon. "Of course I meant Rowan. Your lordship has no other enemies." "If his lordship has no other enemies, why is his beautiful city burning?" inquired Lady Prov, a countess from Acheral. She gestured pleasantly to one of the windows where torrents of distant smoke were pluming into the night. "A routine demonstration in the ghetto," Prusias growled. "Some smoke, but hardly fire. What can one say? Flies are animals." He laughed at the joke, but Lady Prov retained the pinched, disapproving expression that reminded him why he despised her. She was no demon, more of an immortal schoolmarm. "Are we in danger?" she asked politely. "Of course not," Prusias replied. "The Vise live within the lowest district, and workshop gargoyles have already been dispatched. Any troublemakers shall be dealt with." At the far end of the table, an immensely powerful warlord blew a smoke ring from his amber pipe. The Rakshasa gestured lazily at the flustered engineers, his eyes 3 emerald slits within his tigerish face. "I hope your gargoyles weren't built by these gentlemen," he purred. "You should let me bring my legions within the city, Prusias. They're more reliable than your toys." The threat was obvious to everyone in the room, even the dullest imps, courtiers, and concubines. Other than Queen Lilith, Lord Grail was the closest thing Prusias had to a true rival. Unfortunately, he was far too valuable to eliminate at this stage of the war. If Prusias lost Grail's support, half the Bremas and Malicos and Azer might revolt. Still, he could not let such an obvious taunt go unanswered. Prusias raised his glass. "Very generous, Lord Grail. Fortunately, I've Lord Braden's legions at my disposal. But rest assured, I won't forget your offer." With a knowing smirk, the Rakshasa raised his glass. Lord Braden was the unfortunate demon Prusias had chosen to make an example of at his party. Hundreds of guests had witnessed their king savagely batter and decapitate a powerful rival with his bare hands in the grand ballroom. Prusias had not even wiped the blood from his breathless, grinning face when he declared Braden's lands forfeit and all his legions and servants property of the king. The message had spread among the Bremas like wildfire. This could be you. Still, Prusius could not ignore the obvious. While the party had been a rousing success, tonight was turning into a disaster. As the servants poured more wine, Prusius surveyed his other guests. A score of vital Brahmas, several witches, a representative from the lesser demons who had settled the former Americas, his worthless advisors. His eyes settled on a human woman, auburn-haired and striking. She was seated at one of the side tables, next to a kitsune who played the sweetest Belial in bliss. Unlike most humans, the woman seemed at ease among Daemona. She couldn't be from the workshop. This woman actually had grace and style. Turning, Prusius motioned for Mr. Bond.
"Who is she?"
he whispered in the imp's ear.
"The woman, seated next to Maricourt."
Madame Petra, my lord. She was very influential among the human settlements before Rowan took her hostage.
"The smuggler from Piter's Folly."
The imp nodded. Yes, my lord. Apparently she did not take part in Rowan's defense and felt uncomfortable remaining. She was permitted to leave. Prusius's face darkened.
"How do we know she's not a spy?"
She blames Rowan for her husband's death. She prospered at Piter's Folly. She is being watched. And we have insurance.
"What insurance?"
Her daughter, sighed Mr. Bond. Young Katerina is now our special guest and has been housed with the workshop children. The king grunted his approval. Special guests were hostages, an almost meaningless asset when dealing with other demons, but marvelous currency with humans. They became very compliant when their loved ones were threatened. The demon's eyes wandered hungrily over her figure to pause at a coppery gleam about her lovely neck. Prusius had a remarkably keen eye for luxury, and could appraise most items at a glance. The smuggler's torque was not fashioned of copper or red gold. It was made from one of the rarest materials on earth, the quills of a limeril. Prusius was exceedingly curious how it had fallen into the woman's possession. A greedy flame kindled in the demon's eye. The smuggler and her torque, he coveted them both.
"Invite her to dinner this week," he muttered. "In the meantime, find out what the bloody hold-up is. If we can't view the attack, I want to know. I'm tired of sitting here grinning like a fool."
The imp bowed and walked briskly away to where Dr. Weil was conferring anxiously with his colleagues. When Mr. Bond had his word, the engineer nodded and mopped a face shining with perspiration. Beckoning to one of his associates, a young man monitoring a silver case adorned with dials and glass tubes, Dr. Weil walked swiftly over. The Malachim stood aside to permit them approach. The engineer and his young assistant bowed. "Your Majesty," said Dr. Weil, "please allow me to explain the difficulties." Prusius cocked his head. There were so many powerful demons in the room that their auras overlapped into a nebulous haze. But now that Prusius could see Dr. Weil's colleague up close, he noticed something very peculiar.
"I would very much like to hear your explanations, Dr. Weil. Let's begin with why a workshop engineer is maroon."
The geneticist blinked. "Pardon?" Prusius pointed at the young man, clutching his little gadget.
"Maroon," he repeated. "Your colleague is a magical human. Were you aware of this?"
I suppose he must be," stammered Dr. Weil. "It didn't occur to me to mention—" Prusius cut the man off and fixed his eyes on the maroon.
"Who are you?"
he asked gruffly. The young man had broad shoulders, short blonde hair, and an earnest air. Prusius could smell fear, but the maroon kept his composure as he bowed. "Jason Barrett, Your Majesty. I serve in the workshops." "Dr. Barrett is not a regular part of my team," put in Dr. Weil anxiously. "He's just a technician we borrowed to—" The engineer fell silent as Prusius held up his hand.
"Dr. Weil, if you interrupt, you will dine on your own tongue. Continue, Dr. Barrett."
"As I was saying, Your Majesty, I serve in the workshop's communications division. Dr. Weil asked me here to assist with the broadcast."
"So you're to blame for all of this,"
the demon simmered, gesturing at the blank screens lining the far wall. "With all due respect, the Earth's atmosphere is to blame," replied the engineer. There's been a sizable shift in its magnetic field that's interfering with our equipment. We're trying to adjust our instruments to compensate." Prusius waved off the technical gibberish.
"Will there be a show?"
he asked pointedly. "Yes, Your Majesty."
"Would you stake your life on it?"
"I believe I just did." Prusius had to chuckle. Despite his present irritation, he liked this young engineer. He possessed a bit of dash, so woefully absent from the average workshop drone.
"Were you aware that you are maroon, Dr. Barrett?"
"Of course, Your Majesty. I graduated from Rowan." Prusius digested this slowly.
"Did you now?"
"Yes, Your Majesty. 5 years ago. Top of my class."
"Good for you, lad. And how does a Rowan graduate come to be at the workshop, pray tell?"
"They offered an internship, and I accepted. That was back before the troubles began." Prusius laughed and gazed about the magnificent room.
"What troubles, Dr. Barrett? We seem to be doing rather well."
"Troubles for Rowan," the young man clarified. "Troubles for common humanity."
"Common humanity," Prusius repeated. "I like that phrase. You're certainly not common humanity, Dr. Barrett. A workshop engineer who hails from Rowan. Are you a spy?"
The question was asked with a casual air, but there was nothing casual about its underlying gravity. The demon studied the human closely, his senses attuned for the innumerable tells that betrayed all but the cleverest liars. "No, Your Majesty, I'm not a spy. I enjoyed my time at Rowan, but I'm a member of the workshop now. A member anxious to give Your Majesty his show." Prusius nodded. He would have Dr. Barrett watched, of course, but he had passed his initial test. There had been none of the telltale signs of falsehood, not even an intensification of the fear that pulsed with every beat of that strong heart.
"How much longer will you need, Dr. Barrett?" said Prusius. "As you can see, my guests are growing restless."
The technician gestured at his silver case, whose tubes were giving off a faint, phosphorescent light. 5 minutes, Your Majesty. I believe we're getting close."
"Excellent," said Prusius. He turned to Dr. Weil. "Do you have the time?"
The puzzled engineer retrieved an antique pocket watch from his coat. Taking it from him, Prusius rose from his seat and rapped his knife gently against a glass.
"Lords and ladies," he announced, "my honored guests, please accept my apologies for the delay in presenting this evening's entertainment. I've been assured it is due to the Earth's magnetic field and not the workshop's incompetence."
This elicited some welcome laughter. Prusius scanned his audience, his eyes drifting to the smuggler, who was listening attentively.
"What a delightful-looking woman."
He gave a smile just for her.
"I've also been assured," the king continued, "that the problem can be remedied and our show will begin shortly. Like you, however, I grow impatient for entertainment, and thus, while Dr. Weil explains what you will be seeing, we will give this young man 5 minutes to fix his little problem. Should he fail, you may do whatever you like with him and the rest of his workshop associates. Whether the show goes on or not, you shall be entertained."
Lord Grail sat up with interest, as did a number of other Brahmas. While Dr. Weil began sweating like a cheese, the technician turned his attention to his contraption, studying the tubes and adjusting its dials with admirable calm. Glancing at the pocket watch, Prusius waited for the slender hand to reach the 12.
"The time begins now."
Heads turned toward Dr. Barrett as he spent several minutes adjusting various dials by infinitesimal gradations. Now and again the glass tubes flared with phosphorescent light, and the many screens flickered. But an instant later, the tubes dimmed, and the screens went dark. "Frequencies are all over the place," the technician grumbled. "We need a better antenna." "How much time does he have, Your Majesty?" inquired Dr. Weil anxiously.
90 seconds,
replied Prusius. Sweat was streaming down Dr. Weil's face as he gazed about at the demons, his ashen colleagues, and the blank displays. Meanwhile, Dr. Barrett set down his receiver and stared at it, as though it were a particularly challenging puzzle. Spittle flew from Dr. Weil's lips.
"What are you doing?" he cried. "Pick it up! Keep adjusting it!"
Dr. Barrett ignored him, choosing instead to gaze about the magnificent room, at its many fixtures and ornaments. Prusius looked on with interest as the technician strode suddenly toward Madame Petra. "What is that?" Dr. Barrett asked, pointing toward her torque. "My necklace," she replied coolly. "No," he said impatiently. "What's it made from?" "A limeral's quills." She turned to allow her fellow guests a glimpse of the wondrous metal. "Can I have it?" asked Dr. Barrett. "Certainly not." "Just for a moment," he pressed. "Please." With a glance at her host, Madame Petra slipped the coppery torque off her slender neck and let it dangle round her finger.
10 seconds,
said Prusius, locking eyes with the smuggler. Snatching the torque from her hand, Dr. Barrett raced back to the receiver. Prusius glanced back at the pocket watch.
5, 4, 3.
Dr. Barrett touched the torque to the receiver. Its tubes blazed like bottled flares, causing the wall of workshop screens to flash on. Their images, although moving swiftly, were crystal clear.
"Bravo!" cried
Prusius, clapping his great hands.
"And they say necessity is the mother of invention. Ha! It's desperation. Well done, Dr. Barrett."
Rising from the table, Lord Grail approached the screens, pipe smoke trailing from the corners of his mouth.
"What are we looking at, Prusius?" "The assault on Rowan's fleet."
The Rakshasa squinted, trying to make sense of the chaotic images. It looked as though hundreds of individual cameras were racing along ship decks, up masts, over bodies, while great waves crashed over the side, washing over the lens or sending the little cameraman on spinning, careening journeys into the gunnels.
"When did this happen?"
asked Grail, his expression grave and contemplative. Prusius laughed.
"It's happening right now, Lord Grail. We are witnessing the assault as it occurs. Dr. Barrett, is it possible to focus on 1 or 2 images? This many is too difficult to follow. A view of activity aboard the flagship would be ideal. Dr. Weil, if you would explain what we're seeing."
Sliding a panel out from the receiver's base, Dr. Barrett adjusted several controls. The frenzy of images upon the screens were quickly reduced, consolidating down to a few dozen, and then finally to 2. Prusius watched Dr. Barrett's face closely as the young man looked up from his controls to monitor what was happening on the screens. There was no emotion upon his face, no indication that these were his former friends, classmates, and teachers under attack. Dr. Barrett was just a competent technician doing his job. He might have been training his camera on butterflies.
"Good,"
thought Prusius.
"I'd hate to get rid of him unnecessarily. Unlike Dr. Weil, this one doesn't buckle under a bit of pressure."
A single, very dark, panoramic scene appeared on the screens. A recovered Dr. Weil cleared his throat. "Ladies and gentlemen, as you know, Rowan launched a sizable force several weeks ago. To intercept them, we have engineered a highly predatory organism whose natural capabilities have been enhanced with a mechanized exoskeleton and even skin scrolling. With His Majesty's support and blessing, we have produced a shoal of 60 creatures in a highly accelerated time frame."
"How big is that creature?"
asked Lord Grail, staring at a squid-like tentacle that whipped across the screen. "Almost as long as a Hedesian galleon," replied the engineer, 200 to 300 feet, depending on the individual specimen. Our estimates suggest they will sink even the largest warships in less than 20 minutes. Lord Grail's smirk vanished in gratifying fashion.
"That's right, friend,"
thought Prusius.
"Once they're finished with Rowan, these monsters will be lurking off your coast and strangling your trade. And when you can't pay my levies, I'll offer your lands to your Bramers in exchange for your head. You won't last a week."
Dr. Weil scrolled to another image, a split screen of 2 repellent, insect-like creatures. While the Kraken is designed predominantly as a ship destroyer, it's also a troop carrier. Each specimen is capable of depositing 48 pin legs and 12 scorps upon any ship it's attacking. The pin legs create havoc and relay information back to command. while the larger scorps engage enemy personnel. Both have been programmed to recognize and prioritize high-value targets. While a crew fends off the scorps and pinlegs, the Kraken destroys their ship. Dr. Barrett, if you would optimize the output spectrum. Another adjustment, and night turned into day, revealing an ocean teeming with ships and monsters. The formation of the Rowan fleet was like an arrowhead. The Krakens looked like pale, bloated squids, with round, luminescent eyes and chitinous plates armoring portions of their heads and tentacles. The creatures had struck the larger ships in the vanguard, where a furious battle was being waged. From the aerial view, it had an almost serene majesty, with heavy seas churning into foam, while sails flapped and fluttered away like party streamers. Here and there, gargantuan tentacles flailed up from the sea to crash upon decks or wrap themselves about the hulls and masts. Naturally, Rowan was responding. Bolts of lightning shivered and forked down from the sky, striking the whitecaps and krakens as they surged beneath the surface. Wherever the lightning struck, great puffs of steam rose like geysers. Satisfaction ripened in Dr. Wile's voice. This is playing out like our simulations. As you can see, Rowan's mystics are utilizing electricity. While this is a sensible response, it is also doomed to failure, since the Krakens possess hyper-regenerative abilities. Unless catastrophic damage is inflicted in a very short period of time, the beasts will repair their injuries. Rowan would have more success if they focused on one at a time, but of course, they don't know that. This pronouncement was followed by a dry, rasping laugh.
Cold fish, this one,
reflected Prusius. With humans, cruelty and cowardice were often found together. One of the Brahmas thumped his table as a frigate suddenly broke in half. The sea was already littered with wreckage. Prusius focused on one of the largest galleons, his galleon, as a second Kraken fastened onto it. The gargantuan vessel had almost tipped onto its side, masts and spars snapping as the monsters tightened their hold. A massive flash of lightning rippled across the screen. An instant later, the screen ghosted completely, bathing the room in a phosphorescent glow. "Switch to another feed, Dr. Barrett," said Dr. Wile calmly. "Nothing to worry about, ladies and gentlemen. Some lightning just got too close to that particular pinlegs. Ah, there we are." The aerial feed resumed as another pinleg swept over the scene. Great clouds of steam billowed past its lens, revealing the galleon as it began to right itself like a bobbing cork. The Krakens were sinking back into the sea, their tentacles sliding limp and lifeless off the decks. A cold knot formed in Prusius's stomach.
Who's on that ship?
For the moment, however, Dr. Wile was speechless. The king wheeled upon Dr. Barrett.
Who's on that damn ship?
The technician quickly adjusted his controls, switching the feed to one from a pinlegs upon its deck. The creature was racing along, weaving between fallen bodies and wreckage as it scuttled toward some objective. Sound flooded the viewing room, a cacophony of cries, groaning timbers, and the rapid tink-tink-tink of the creature's many legs. It passed under a slower scorp that was apparently rushing at the same target. Dr. Wile found his voice. "Someone important. All the pinlegs and scorps are heading for them, so it must be a top priority target. The director, possibly, or—"
"Menlo,"
Prusius growled, lumbering forward to glare at the figure on screen. The young sorcerer's pale face grew larger, crisper, as the pinleg scuttled toward him. He was bleeding profusely and leaning against the splintered base of a mast, but the boy seemed to have his wits about him.
"Was he standing over someone?"
When Prusius glimpsed the fallen person's face, he almost shouted. He restrained himself, however. The glimpse was brief, the face obscured, and the pinlegs was moving swiftly, its lens trembling as it zoomed in on its target. Several other pinlegs and scorps were even closer, all converging upon David Menlo. Scowling, Menlo raised his hand. Instantly, the pinlegs and scorps jolted backward, as though they'd struck an invisible wall. For a second, the screen showed only sky, as the pinlegs was flipped onto its back. It righted itself in a flurry of kicking legs and snapping feelers. But soon it was flipped again, now flying backward in a dizzying, alternating jumble of ship and sky. A sharp crackle of static, and the feed went dead.
"Switch to another,"
ordered Prusius, his eyes locked on the screen. "Those on deck are out of commission," reported Dr. Barrett. "I'll switch back to an aerial view." Instantly the screen illuminated, relaying a flyby over the flagship's deck. David Menlo remained where he'd been, but every pin legs and scorps had been blasted 100 feet away, where they lay in tangled, smoking heaps of legs, body segments, and stingers. The on-screen image began to shake violently. "What's happening?" asked Lady Prov. "Is that an earthquake?"
"The camera's airborne," Lord Grail muttered. "Why would an earthquake make it shake?"
Prusius turned toward Dr. Barrett.
"Why is it doing that?"
The technician frowned at his receiver. The light within its tubes was pulsing wildly, creating little arcs of electricity that danced against the glass. "It's some sort of atmospheric disturbance," he reported. "I'll switch to a higher altitude." The new feed showed a broader view of the sea, a sea that appeared to be hissing and boiling as steam billowed off its surface. Beyond the flagship, another galleon sheared in half, a kraken wrenching the stern away in an explosion of splintered timbers. Prusius cackled. But again, the picture started trembling, jostling and shaking violently, as though a train were rumbling past.
"Can't you fix that?"
snapped Prusius. The technologists were ruining his show. "I'm trying, Your Majesty," said Dr. Barrett. "It's just—" The technician trailed off, his mouth agape as he stared at the screen. Several people gasped as all muffled conversation ceased. Prusius turned back to the screen. Ships were rising into the air. Dozens of carracks, frigates, even Hadesian galleons were being lifted slowly out of the sea as though by invisible cranes. Water streamed down their broken hulls, running over the krakens that clung to them. In the midst of this impossible scene hovered a tiny, solitary figure.
Brom!
As Dr. Barrett zoomed in, Prusius's fears were confirmed. He saw the man all too clearly, his arms outstretched, his hair whipping wildly about. The sorcerer looked like a rabid wolf, his eyes blank and white, his face twisted into a strained and snarled grimace.
"Gods, what a foe!"
The picture flickered and dimmed suddenly, as though its energy was drawn away, absorbed by the sorcerer. Brom was glowing now, his body crackling with heat and light. Prusius glanced at the technician's machine. Its tubes were almost dark. He gazed back at the screen, resigned to what was about to happen. When Brom screamed, great bolts of energy shot from his hands, striking the nearest krakens and instantly arcing to the others to form a buckling, incandescent latticework. Krakens split apart, their exoskeletons melting as they dropped from the hovering ships like huge, shriveled spiders. The display was growing brighter. From the corner of his eye, Brom saw the technician set down the receiver and back away. The tubes exploded in a spray of tiny glass shards as the receiver skittered off the table. Every screen went black. Madame Petra's torque clattered onto the inlaid floor, where it rolled in a slow, wobbling arc before toppling over. No one spoke. All eyes followed the king as he paced slowly past their tables and bent down to pick up the smoking torque. There was a hiss as the metal touched his flesh, but the demon paid it no mind. He was too busy processing, soaking in what he had just seen. He set the torque down on the smuggler's dessert plate.
"Thank you for letting us borrow this,"
he muttered absently. The woman nodded, her fear mingling wonderfully with her perfume. Returning to his table, Prusius called for wine. A servant hurried over to fill his glass.
"I'm surrounded by insects,"
mused Prusius, noting that the servant's hands were trembling. With an inward sigh, he glanced up at his guests and raised his glass.
"A toast to your entertainment and my victory."
Wary looks were exchanged as the Bremas and other guests raised their glasses and took a sip. Only Lord Grail abstained. Leaning back in his chair, the Rakshasa puffed on his pipe with an insolent smile.
What victory is that, friend Prusius?
He called. Wiping wine from his mouth, Prusius fixed the demon with a penetrating stare.
Were you not attending, Grail? My victory is all but assured.
With a savage laugh, the Rakshasa thumped the table so that its dishes clattered.
I'm just an old warrior, Prusius,
he confessed amiably.
I have not your taste for politics and cleverness. Only a warped mind, or human mind, could prize victory for what I just saw. That's your problem, Grail,
replied Prusius.
Your imagination has a very short leash. You see a battle that's been lost. I see a war that's been won. Let Rowan crow about their triumph at sea. They've lost dozens of ships, thousands of people, and, unless I'm very much mistaken, they've also lost their director.
How do you know that? Inquired Lady Prov.
She was at David Menlo's feet,
replied Prusius, sniffing his wine.
I only had a glimpse, but I don't believe I'm mistaken. No, I'd wager Gabrielle Richter has seen her last sunset.
The demon glanced at Dr. Barrett, curious if the news would have any effect on the Rowan graduate. But it had not. The technician looked as impassive as his colleagues.
You spoke true, my boy. You do belong to the workshop. The director doesn't matter, spat Grail. What matters is Brom. You said he wouldn't fight Rowan's battles. I was surprised as any to see him, said Prusius. The man didn't lift a finger to defend Rowan when we besieged them. Why should he do so now?
The demon shrugged.
I don't know why he aided them, Grail, but I'm pleased he did. Magic has its price, you know, even for one such as he. That display we just witnessed was very impressive, and very costly. It will take months, perhaps years, for Brom to fully recover. Rowan just fired its biggest weapon before their army even landed.
Lord Grail sat perfectly rigid, almost pinned by Prusius's stare.
Someone pour my friend some wine, said Prusius, grinning savagely at his rival. He neglected to toast my victory.
The wine was poured and set before Lord Grail, who eyed it as though it were hemlock. Nevertheless, the demon stood and raised the glass high.
To Prusius and his victory, your Brahma salutes you.
Draining the glass, the proud Rakshasa smashed it on the floor and stormed from the chamber. Most of his guests looked horrified, but Prusius merely chuckled.
That's how I like you, Grail. Humbled and angry. God help the first enemies I set you upon.